Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alan Harlem. I'm the Director of Social Innovation at the Swearer Center. And it is really my honor and privilege to welcome you here today and to introduce Scott Warren. I met Scott in the fall of 2008, the fall of his senior year at Brown, when he and his co-founder Anna Ninen had an idea to explore how civics was being taught, or actually mostly not being taught, but really how could it be taught in a way that would be a catalyst for greater participation in the democracy. That idea ended up being a pilot in a few classrooms in Rhode Island, in Providence. And when Scott graduated, he decided to create a national organization around that's revolutionizing really the way that civics is being taught in our schools, now in 6 cities across the country and reaching thousands of young people. I have a really deep friendship with Scott that started with the founding of Generation Citizen, but he has also been an incredibly generous and engaged member of Brown's social innovation community, mentoring many students along the way, being a sounding board and an advisor to our work, and leading to his invitation to Brown this semester as a social entrepreneur in residence and a Taubman Fellow, where he is spending this entire semester on campus teaching a course about social innovation through the lens of his experience at Generation Citizen and civics education, but also doing his own research, expanding his own knowledge base, thinking about really the future of the democracy. And I really couldn't have planned this any better to have someone whose thought leadership is around democracy or the future of democracy in our country on campus at this particular moment. I don't think that topic has ever been a more important one to have at Brown and in the world. And so it gives me really great pleasure to welcome Scott to give a talk about civics, education, and the future of our democracy.
So thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to Alan. So I graduated here in 2009. I was a concentrator, international relations at Watson, so it's great to be back here. And I've never spoken up here before, and what I was thinking is that my father actually has. And so my senior year of college, he was the chief political officer in Zimbabwe for the American Embassy, and so he gave a talk on Zimbabwe here. But the funny thing is, I was thinking about as Alan was introducing me, is that even though he was giving a talk, I said that, and I did, but had a prior commitment, so I couldn't make the beginning of his talk. So I actually didn't even introduce my own dad to speak. And so when I told him that I was giving a talk here today, he said, well, I hope that you get a good introduction. So I appreciate Alan for giving a good introduction like I did not necessarily do for my dad. Excited to talk to you all a little bit here today about my work at Generation Citizen, how I personally came to this work, and some of that will include my experience here at Brown. And as Alan said, I've been privileged to have some time to think here at Brown about some of these bigger questions of what does it mean to live in a democracy right now. I think one of the questions that I've been looking into is our democracy really more broken than it has been? I think that's something that we hear about a lot, but if we actually look at empirical evidence, is our democracy more broken than it has been in previous times? And then this other question of does participation actually matter? So we're all often talking about how Americans don't participate in the process, or they don't participate like they used to, in trying to figure out the ramifications of those through the lens of the work that I do at Generation Citizen. So to start out, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that we always throw around this term democracy. without necessarily understanding what the term democracy actually means. And I think especially in current times, we say, oh, our democracy is not working. So just taking some time to think about what does democracy actually mean. So this is a little bit more of the idealistic definition from our 16th president. The government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so that's one definition for us to think about. And then another one by the philosopher H.L. Mencken, democracy is only a dream. It should be put in the same category as Arcadia, Santa Claus, and heaven. And one that maybe more people relate to this one than Lincoln's definition in current times. But to get even more specific, so these are people philosophizing around the meaning of democracy. These are the actual definitions of democracy. So democracy is, and this is Merriam-Webster dictionary, government by the people, or rule of the majority, in a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercise them by directly or indirectly through a system of representation. So it's just worth thinking about this for a second, because I think at the very core, democracy is citizens participating in the act of governance, which is worth talking about when we think about, well, does democracy work or does democracy not work? I was in my class last week, and we were just having a discussion on whether we should take a break now or take a break in 20 minutes. So I decided to have a vote, and the people that wanted to take a break in 20 minutes won. And someone said, and I said, well, that's how democracy works. And she said, well, that's not a democracy. And I said, well, actually, technically, it is a democracy because people participated in the process of us deciding what we should actually do. And so I think it's interesting when we think about this, because I think sometimes democracy, we think of it as meaning more than it actually does in terms of creating certain outcomes. This is not outcome oriented, this is process oriented to the extent of people actually thinking about what it means to participate in the act of governance. Now, what we do by participating in that act of governance is a completely separate conversation, but one that we'll talk about. But I do think that the distinction between what it means to live in a democracy where people actually help make decisions, we might not like those decisions. Which is I think something to think about in the current context. Along those lines, I think it's worth reflecting on what it means to be a citizen. So if we're talking about democracy as being part of a system where citizens make the rules and responsibilities, this is something that I've reflected on a bit, because I think the term citizen, and I'm not referring here to the legal definition, which I think in current times gets thrown around a lot, but there's three really different connotations that come with the term citizen, and we've done some research on this. So the first is that it's a right. And so these are all the different rights that we have as citizens. This is largely in the American context, but I think it can be applied internationally as well. It's a right to express oneself freely, worship as one wishes, a prompt fair trial by jury, to vote in elections for public officials, to apply for federal employment, run for elected office, pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So these are the rights that we have as citizens. So it's important that we do have certain rights as citizens. The next vein is responsibility. I think that this notion of citizenship does not get talked about enough. I think a lot of times we talk about our rights, we don't necessarily talk about our responsibilities. And this is something that I think especially elected officials are quick to talk about rights, but don't necessarily want to push down responsibilities on the citizens that elect them. And so again, these are actual definitions largely in the Constitution. Supporting and defending the Constitution, staying informed of the issues affecting one's community. This is a responsibility of citizenship, is actually staying informed of what's going on. Participating, respecting, and obeying federal, state, and local laws, respecting the rights, beliefs, and opinions of others, again, something that we may have lost track of a bit, participating in your local community, paying taxes, serving on a jury when called upon, and defending the country if the need should arise. That's the notion of the military responsibility. So I think these are interesting to reflect on, because I'm wondering how much of these we actually think about our responsibilities as citizens versus how we engage in everyday life. So worth reflecting on these. And the last one is, this is a cultural ideal. This is a little bit more vague, so it's worth reflecting on. But what does it mean that we have a society in which we value the concept of citizenship? So infused with moral meaning, encompassed by normative principles, values, and expectations that derive from the social, historical, and cultural context of the times. It's interesting thinking about the specific times we're in and what that means for the conception of citizenship. So thinking about the rights, the responsibilities, the cultural ideals that come with citizenship, I did not in this section refer to what it means to be an American citizen. And so we can talk about the distinction between being a global citizen and being an American citizen. But I think in the context of our democracy, when we think about democracy being citizens actually participating in the process, it's worth recognizing what it means to be a citizen. And again, specifically, the one that I harp on, which is interesting because politically this gets muddled a bit too, is the one of responsibility, because I don't think that that's one that we think about enough. But again, happy to go through and think about and talk about that as we go forward. So as we've talked about this identity of citizenship, I wanted to sort of get away from the more philosophical for a second and go into my own identity, because my own identity has helped inform the actual work that I do, and it's an identity that I'm still trying to figure out even while I'm here at Brown, which is also part of my identity. So I referred to this in my opening remarks, but my father was in the State Department. So I originally grew up in San Diego, California, but at the age of 8, my dad had essentially the definition of a midlife crisis, tired of being a criminal defense attorney, and decided to join the Foreign Service. So I first moved to the Dominican Republic, then Argentina, and then Kenya and Ecuador. So from 8 to 18, I lived outside of this country. So in terms of thinking of my own citizenship, the majority of my childhood, especially the majority of my conscious childhood, I actually spent outside of the country where I derived citizenship from, although I was the son of someone that actually worked in the government. But when I think of my identity, a specific place that I often talk about is Kenya. So this top picture is when I was in 9th grade. Obviously, cultural appropriation happening to some extent there. But I think it's relevant to the extent that this was our class trip in 9th grade. And my two best friends, and we went out to actually stay with the Maasai in a place called Magadi in the desert of Kenya. And the picture below is a story that I often talk about, which really helped galvanize me about the concept of democracy and why I care so much about the concept of democracy. When I was in 10th grade in 2002, my father, who was working as a political officer in the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi at the time, decided to take me out to this rural village during Kenya's 2002 elections, which were the first truly democratic elections they had in their history. So this picture was taken with my regular camera, because this is 2002, so pardon the quality. At about 5:30 in the morning, and this is outside of a schoolhouse. And seeing, I still remember how incredibly excited people were to participate in the process, to actually feel like they could have a voice in the overall government that they were producing in Kenya. And what's interesting is that they were exercising their rights as citizens, hoping for a democracy in which they could actually participate. Their history had not demonstrated that that was possible. This was 2002. Kenya had been independent for about 32 years, and these were the first elections where they thought that there might actually be change. And what happened is that the opposition candidate, Mwai Kibaki, actually won, which in emerging democracies is incredibly rare. 5 years later, Kenya had elections again that did not go as positively. There was reports of widespread rigging, there was violence in the streets, and over 1,000 people died. And so I think that really showed me both the power of democracy when people actually come together to participate, and the fragility of it. It's not a concept that is stagnant, that is always there, but one that has to be tended to throughout. I graduated from high school in Ecuador. My senior year of high school, there was a coup when I was taking the bus home from school. People on the streets were demanding that the despotic leader leave the country. He did. And then when I was at Brown, before my senior year, my parents were living in Zimbabwe, and I went and visited them in the midst of runoff elections there, which again did not go well. Robert Mugabe, who at the age of 93 is still in power, the oldest leader in the world, and has been for since 1980, he rigged the elections. And we talked to opposition members that were literally willing to put their lives on the line and the lives of their family on the line in order to create a better country and a better democracy. And this has always stuck with me. What is it about this concept of democracy that makes people literally willing to die for it? And that's something that I've thought a lot about. So let's fast forward to me starting at Brown. And again, when I arrived at Brown in 2005, I didn't quite feel American. I was from here. I went back to San Diego, but I had spent much more time internationally. And so my own concept of citizenship is not one that I really understood. So orientation was in the end of August in 2005. And I remember that President at the time, Ruth Simmons, was giving this convocation and was becoming very emotional. And we literally had no idea why, because we were immersed in orientation. And the reason is that during orientation, Hurricane Katrina had been ravaging New Orleans. And we were completely oblivious to it because we were enjoying everything that comes with Brown orientation. And President Simmons had attended school at Dillard in New Orleans. And my first reaction at the time was like, this is just, Americans going off on their own problems. They have it so much better than the rest of the world. That was my perception of America, having lived in all of these different places. And then during spring break, Brown actually set up this program to help send Brown students to New Orleans to help rebuild. And that was one of the more powerful experiences that I had in terms of recognizing my own American identity. So the fact that we had allowed Hurricane Katrina to ravage an entire area, and that we went to that area 6 months after the fact, and there were still people that did not have their homes. I remember, seeing numbers marked on the houses, which was how many people had lived in those houses and how many people had actually survived. There would be, MW for men and women, and there would actually be, one for dogs as well. And I just remember how powerful that was, and me thinking at the time, maybe I have to reflect on what it actually means to be an American. At the same time, while I was at Brown, I got very active in issues relating to the genocide in Darfur, Sudan. So again, this is 2005, 2006. My dad had worked in Sudan when we lived in Kenya. I learned a lot about the genocide in Rwanda, and it was something that I cared a lot about, this promise that we had made as a country never again to allow genocide to happen. So I got very active on these issues and actually helped efforts. Brown became the 5th university in the country to divest from Sudan in February of 2006, and then pushed for similar efforts at the state as well. And so these are 3 different ways in which I was active at Brown, which I think is sort of interesting because it shows the in the system and outside the system aspects of this. So on the far, I guess, my left is outside of Fonts Arch. This is when the university was making the decision to divest. And it was an interesting rally because we were protesting on Fonts steps outside the corporation meeting at about 8 a.m. on a Saturday. And the provost at the time, or the chancellor at the time, Stephen Roberts, came out, and we thought he was going to chastise us. And he said, well, actually, Brown just made the decision to divest from Sudan, which is an interesting thing that happens when protesters actually realize that they were successful. They don't always know what to do. And then the top left is actually Governor Donald Carcieri, a Brown alum at the time, signing legislation to divest the state of Rhode Island from Sudan. And that was after my sophomore year of college. And the bottom is me getting arrested in front of the White House in April of 2000 and I think it was April of 2005. April of 2009. April of 2008, because it was still during the Bush administration. And so this was us trying to push the president to make this a legacy issue. And this was really how I learned Rhode Island politics, through actually, leaving my class early Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3:30 and walking down to the State House and lobbying legislators to actually focus on Rhode Island specific legislation. And I think we got something done, and I learned a lot about Rhode Island politics. But at the same time, I still had this sort of gnawing recognition that I had some sort of American identity and some obligation to actually improve conditions in the American political experience as well. And so this is something that I've been struggling with throughout my life, even while I serve as a social entrepreneur in residence here. But my senior year at Brown, I was having a little bit of recognition that I focused all on Sudan. I took this trip to New Orleans and did Katrina. What can I do to help improve our own American democracy? Is there anything I can help do to improve our American democracy? And started doing research and recognizing that while I was really passionate about politics and democracy through a lot of my own experiences, recognizing that Brown students a lot of the times are passionate about making change, but not necessarily through the lens of politics, not through the lens of existing institutions. So the need is, you could go on this all day. The chart that shows that 9%, this is something the New York Times did a few months ago, and essentially 9% of eligible voters either voted for Hillary Clinton or Trump in the primaries. So this demonstrates how few people actually voted in the primary system as it pertains to the overall electorate. So a lot of times people say, oh, well, the system thrust these candidates on us, or we didn't like these candidates, but only 9% of Americans either voted for Hillary or for Trump in the primaries, because you had a low percentage of people that voted in the primaries, and then they got between 55 to 60% of the overall place. Young people, as I said, are increasingly divorcing from the political process, but they're not apathetic. And I think that's an important distinction to be made. A lot of times older generations will be, oh, like young people, they just don't care about making the world a better place. That's not necessarily what's happening. 64% want to make the world a better place, but they don't trust the government. And by a 2-to-1 margin, see volunteering as a better way to make change than participating in politics. And that has ramifications. And these are I'll go through this later, but historically these are much lower than historical rates as well. There's a gap in terms of who's actually learning to participate in the process. And the last thing is we often talk about how American students aren't learning English, or they're not learning math, or they're not learning STEM. But the two subjects on which American students test worse on are civics and history. So civics has been fundamentally marginalized in the curriculum. History has been marginalized, and students aren't actually learning how to participate. So I learned all of this during my senior year and thought, well, how can we actually get young people to feel as passionate about politics as I saw when I was observing those elections in Kenya, and really see democracy as something that we should participate in because it can be galvanizing and a way to make a collective difference as individuals. And so started Generation Citizen my senior year at Brown. Alan talked about this. Our mission is to ensure that every young person in this country receives an effective action civics education. So we're trying to bring civics back into schools, and we're trying to make it action-oriented and relevant. So even when I say the word civics, oftentimes people's eyes glaze over, and they think it's the most boring class in school, or schools don't offer it, period. And so what we actually do is that we've created a curriculum where, just like young people might learn science best through doing science experiments, young people learn civics through taking action on very local issues that they care about in their community. That might be teen jobs, that might be public transit, it might be, I was at a middle school in Providence, Gilbert Stewart today, and they were looking at climate change, and then they're going to figure out what can Providence and Rhode Island actually do about that. Rhode Island's looking to become the first state in the country to impose a carbon tax on companies. Is there a way that our students can learn about local politics through actually participating in that legislation? And so we implement that curriculum during the school day. It's important that it's not an after-school activity, it's not an extracurricular, but that students are taking this just like they're taking math or science or English. And then the other component is that we partner college volunteers with middle and high school teachers to actually teach the class. So it's this peer to near peer model. Started that, as Alan said, I first started talking to him in 2008. I knew the conception of what I wanted to do, but didn't really know what I was doing. Right now, we're in 6 cities across the country, so we're still in Rhode Island and have an active office here. We then went to Massachusetts, New York, the San Francisco Bay Area. In the last 6 months, we've expanded into Central Texas and Oklahoma City as well, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't just working in the coast with people that might agree with our specific political ideology. So that's been an interesting experience too. Our mission, as I said before, is to ensure that all students receive an effective action civics education. The only way to get there is not through, it's not that every student in this country should receive Generation Citizen, but we're thinking about how do we engage in policy, advocacy, demand building work, so that civics and action civics is seen as a need to have and not a nice to have. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's external circumstances that have made that case a little bit easier than we might have made on our own. One thing that we think about that's worth reflecting on, as I talked about citizenship before, that we think about in our own work, there's a paper that came out in 2004 that we use in our work that defines 3 types of citizens. So it's worth reflecting which type of citizen you think you are. But one is personally responsible. So this might be someone that donates to a food bank, follows the laws. One might be participatory. This is someone that organizes a food drive, is a little more involved in their community, votes. And the third is justice-oriented. So someone that asks why people are hungry and is actually trying to change laws and change things around. I was going over this in my class, and we were having a robust conversation about whether these were politically tinged at all. They're really not meant to be. I think that someone that's on the left-leaning side of the aisle can be justice-oriented. I think someone on the right side of the aisle can be justice-oriented. But it's really about who's passionate about actually changing laws to make them more equitable. I also think that you can't have a society in which everybody is justice-oriented. the country wouldn't work. So it's almost seen as a pyramid structure in which you have some folks that are, or you want everybody to be personally responsible. I think we want to get everybody to the point of being participatory, and some people to the nexus of being justice oriented. But we often think about it in our own classes. Are we trying to get our young people to be justice oriented, or is it sufficient for them to be participatory? What we're actually trying to build in our students is thinking about civic knowledge, so how much they know about the political process, civic skills, so their ability to participate in it, and civic motivation, so their desire to actually participate in it. So that's what Generation Citizen does, and happy to talk more about that. But what I will say is that it is, as Alan said, it's very interesting to be here at Brown right now to be thinking about this work because after this past election and given the current political climate, people have been more interested in GC's work than ever. And so why is that the case? And I've been reflecting on that a lot because I started Generation Citizen, as I said, in the fall of 2008. Now, what's interesting about the fall of 2008 is that's when President Obama's campaign was going on, and young people were incredibly galvanized about politics. Young people were incredibly galvanized about politics. But whenever I went to talk to people about, we're trying to start an organization to convince young people to be more politically engaged, they couldn't have been less interested. So there was this disconnect that I was seeing. And I probably was talking to people more on the left side of the aisle, and I think there was a little bit of a sense of, well, we have our guy in the White House, or we're getting our person in the White House, and so what's wrong? Or politics is so ugly we don't want to participate, but it's not the biggest problem that we have. Like, it's going all right or it's going well enough. Which is worth reflecting on. So why in the aftermath of Trump, in the aftermath of Brexit, are people saying that civics education is more important than it's ever been? And I don't quite know the answer to that. I think that one could presuppose the answer to it is that when people have outcomes that they don't like, they're looking for ways to change those outcomes. But the thing that I have been reflecting on is what is different, and is our democracy more broken than it has been before? I do think that the crux of what some people are saying, especially people that I'm talking to, and we talk to people that agree with us more than we don't, is that there is this sense of, people that voted in favor of Brexit or people that voted for Trump are probably less informed voters. I'm not making that presupposition, but I think that at the crux of the argument that some people are making is that, and I hear that all the time, these people don't know anything, they're just voting for him because he's telling all these untruths. I think what is important to think about is that this isn't just a domestic American phenomenon. All across the world, we're seeing the fact that people believe less in the concept of democracy, and there is this reach for strongmen leaders. And I think we are seeing people that don't necessarily believe in the concept of a representative democracy, but want one person to come in and destroy the system and make everything better. And upon reflecting, I also don't think that that's a particularly new phenomenon. I think that a lot of young people, when we elected Barack Obama, actually thought something similar would happen, that the system was fundamentally broken, that we didn't necessarily want to participate in it, but we wanted one person to come in and shake everything up. So does that mean that we're losing faith in democracy, and what does that actually mean? So is it worse than ever before? This is some of the research that we've started doing. So a lot of times we turn to voter turnout. Voter turnout on the aggregate is pretty down in the United States. So we're ranked 31st of 35 OECD countries. If you look at the 2016 elections, about 65 million eligible voters voted for Hillary Clinton, about 63 million voted for Donald Trump, and about 95 million eligible Americans did not vote. And so did not vote was the big winner there. Specifically thinking about young people, we've been on a downward trajectory with young people for essentially the last 3 decades. An estimated 50% voted in the 2016 presidential elections, which actually isn't terrible. But what is important here, to go to the previous point of looking for strongman leaders, is only 20% of 18 to 30-year-olds voted in the 2014 elections, which was the lowest rate since the census actually started measuring that. And so young people are really not participating in elections that aren't at the presidential level, and that's something that's been happening in a while. And then we sort of look at, is partisanship worse than ever? Because a lot of times you think, oh, we've always been partisan, people are overreacting. So there's a lot of stats, but I thought this one was a little bit of a fun one. Gallup's essentially been asking this question since 1960. Would you be okay if your child married someone from the different party? In 1960, 5% of Republicans had a problem with that, 4% of Democrats had a problem with that. In 2010, so this is 6 years ago, I'm sure it's much worse now. In 2010, so 49% of Republicans would have a problem if their child married a Democrat, and 33% of Democrats would have a problem if their child married.
A short question.
Yeah.
On this topic here, there were some things I was reading about a couple of months ago saying that approximately 90 million eligible voters did not vote.
Exactly.
Do
Yeah.
you find that right? That
Yeah.
figure? Oh, it is true.
Yeah.
That's amazing
Yeah.
because those talk shows will never talk about that.
Right.
Because one party gets 56 million, the other one gets 55 million or something, but they don't talk about the other 90 million who didn't vote.
Yeah.
Eligible.
So you're exactly right. The majority, and we're not even talking about local elections, and I'll get to some recent data there too. So what does this actually mean? And let's do a little bit of a more of a historical analysis. So I think that there were polls done in the aftermath. So one thing that people could say is, well, we just had an economic crisis, and after an economic crisis, people are less. They believe less in the ability of government to make change. So in the aftermath of the Great Depression, which caused unemployment over 20%, which was double the unemployment we saw after the latest recession, 50% of Americans believed that economic conditions would improve. So they actually had an optimistic sense and they wanted government to do more. In the Reagan-era recession, 41% were positive about economic conditions improving. In 2010, only 35% expected better conditions. And so this is just demonstrating that there's a lack of belief that government can actually make a difference, and only 20% people now trust the federal government to do what is right most of the time. Which again, going back to the definition of democracy, if we don't believe that the government's going to do the right thing, that's a little bit problematic. And in 1973, so that's the current rate of young people that trust the federal government to do what is right. In 1973, 60% of young people trusted government to do the right thing. What's interesting is Nixon was impeached in 1974. And so it's interesting to think about if that had anything to do with this as well. So the next question that one might ask, or that I think is important to ask, is does participation actually matter? So the fact that 90 million Americans didn't vote, why does that actually make a difference? Isn't it okay if we just have the right person in power, we just elect the right person? Does participation actually matter for economic, social, and political outcomes? And so I've just sort of started to try to get research done on this. One specific thing that I did want to point out, we are in this age where people are saying, oh, post-Trump, people are participating at unheard of rates. You see all the people protesting. Los Angeles had a municipal election last Tuesday. It was for mayor, it was for city council, it was for school board, and it was for a number of important propositions having to do with homelessness, having to do with housing, having to do with healthcare. And 11% of the electorate participated. So that was a big step back for me to see last Tuesday in a city that had 750,000 people show up for the Women's March, which was actually the biggest women's march in the country. LA was bigger than DC. Only 11% of people, it's about 200,000 people. So about 550,000 more people showed up to rally than showed up to vote in elections to actually, and this was school board where you had charter advocates going against folks supported by the labor union, so it was actually real ramifications. But again, why does this actually matter? So again, some of the research that we've looked at is that citizen participation has a direct negative impact on income inequality in a full sample size that some researchers did. What that means is that societies where more people participate have less income inequality, which would seem to make sense, right? The biggest predictor of whether someone in this country votes or not is their income level. And so it would go to presuppose that if you have more general participation, then you have less economic inequality. So I think that's important. And then countries that have lower levels of voter turnout, and so more likely to have unequal participation, have a bigger gap in responsiveness between the rich and the poor. So this is also statistically proven. That if you have poorer people that participate more, they're going to get better services. What happens is, in this country, you have a vicious cycle that we can't break out of. Poor Americans don't vote, so politicians don't pay attention to them, so they think that politicians don't care about them, so they don't participate. But the higher the turnout, the more equal citizens seem to be politically. So again, this is we're just starting to get at it, but the research does seem to demonstrate that, especially as it pertains to inequality, participation matters. And so then you sort of have this fallacy going on, and I don't really know the answer to it, so we can talk about it. But so participation matters, and so we can actually demonstrate that participation matters, and I think you're seeing this time where people realize that who's in charge matters. So why are people turning away? So you have unprecedented amounts of people not participating in a process where we can empirically demonstrate that participation actually matters. And so figuring out why that's the case is something that I think is really interesting. So millennials specifically coming of this age of political paralysis in terms of institutions, declining civility, dramatically increased anxiety, people are fed up. One thing that I see a lot happen is that people blame structures. And what I mean by that is that people don't necessarily blame the citizens. We blame money in politics. We blame gerrymandering. We blame our politicians in Washington, but we don't actually look inward and say, what would happen if we actually participated more? What would happen if, the LA turnout was 60% instead of 11%? What would happen if those 90 million Americans actually voted? And yes, there are some reasons, the Voting Rights Act, parts of it were stricken down. The fact that we vote on a Tuesday probably isn't the greatest thing in the world. But there's still, I don't see as much of a way that we're looking inward. So the last thing that I'm starting to think about and look at, which follows from that, is thinking about, is there a new form of participation? So this is something that a lot of people are talking about, is that if young people are more engaged but they're not voting, are there different forms of participating? There's a lot of interesting experiments being done on the local level throughout the world. So looking at things like participatory budgeting, where communities are actually coming together to make budgetary decisions for their communities. And I think that that's something that we need to increasingly look at, is how do we get young people and citizens overall to be more invested in their communities? Rather than constantly focusing on the federal and constantly focusing on who's president, if we had a way to get people to be more invested in their own communities, my hypothesis is, and we can look at this, but my hypothesis would be, if you participate and vote in Providence, you're probably going to vote for president. But if you vote for president, you're not necessarily going to vote and participate in local measures. So shouldn't it be, if we're trying to solve this problem, that it should be about trying to get people to be more invested in their communities, which is a little bit paradoxical in our current age because we're increasingly globalized and there's different ways for people to get in touch. So I think it's a little bit of envisioning a new form of participation and a little bit of a blast to the past in terms of getting people to reinvest in their own communities. But thinking about citizen-centered approaches where people can actually see how their own participation makes a difference. So that's something that interested in looking at as well. But the last thing I wanted to end with, and we'll take some questions as well, that, especially in this age, post-Brexit, post-Trump, there's all this anxiety that I'm increasingly interested in, is how do we fight for democracy? I see too much of fighting against things right now. So fighting against who's in power, fighting against our fellow citizens. But this harkens back to the original definitions I gave on democracy, the rights and responsibilities and cultural ideals of citizenship. What would it look like to actually engage in a fight for democracy? If we focused on institutions, we focused on the press. And I think my idealism, and sometimes I say that when I graduated here in 2009, I was a little bit more idealistic than I am now, but I'm still incredibly idealistic about the premise of democracy. Now, what that means is I'm just idealistic about the ability of citizens to make good decisions for their country. And in the aftermath of the election, I did a lot of reading of historical biographies of folks like Jefferson and Adams, and it was this completely radical concept at the time that citizens could actually carry forth this citizen-centric conception of government and democracy. But I still think it can work, but we have to change things, and rather than just blaming politicians or rather than blaming institutions, I think there's an ability to look at that notion of what is our own responsibility of citizens to create that more perfect union and that better democracy. So the original question, is civics education or is fighting for democracy more important now in this era of Trump and Brexit than it was before? I don't think it's more important than it was before. I do think that it's more urgent. And so I'm curious in terms of how we can further define what it means to be in a citizen-centric democracy, how we can reinvest in our communities, and how instead of fighting against things, we can fight for our democracy. So would love, I think we have some time for questions. Yeah, if there are any questions.
Hi there. I'm curious about your thoughts on becoming informed in terms of voting. So I think in particular with local elections, it's really hard to find information on what the people who are running actually believe and stand for. So when I go to vote in these elections, I don't necessarily know who I'm voting for and why I'm voting for them. And I think increasingly I'm just kind of voting down a party line and hoping for the best.
Right.
But I don't actually, I want to be informed. I want to know why I'm choosing to vote for a particular candidate. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts around the general public becoming more informed about who they're actually casting their votes for.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think some of this is not in an economic sense, but it's a little bit of a supply and demand. So the more people that would actually demand to know about local politics, the more information there would be. So the Providence Journal as an institution is not doing very well economically because people aren't looking for information from the Providence Journal. But you have national media institutions that are doing better than they've ever done before because people are obsessed with the presidential and people are obsessed with the federal. So the long-term view is, again, this focus on the community. If there can be more of a focus on the community, there would be more information. I think in the short term, there's actually, there's good information out there. And I know Providence and Rhode Island, there's local papers, there's local blogs. And I also say that local officials, especially in this state, and that's why I think it's interesting being at Brown. Brown has an incredibly unique place in the sense of being the second biggest employer in a very small state, where if you call up your city council member, if you call up your state rep, they will talk to you. So I think that some of it is that I would encourage folks to get out there, to look at local blogs, to look at local papers, and I do think that the information is out there. You might have to dig a little bit more for it. And then I think in the long term, I think bringing local papers back would be a good thing too.
On the same question she just asked, I want to say, on the same topic where she's talking about who she's voting for, when I studied in school, I went to political science. Some people were saying that they're really voting for the Electoral College indirectly because they're the people who cast the votes for that particular state or city or whatever that place is. So in a sense, the person should actually vote for the issues and should be informed ahead of time. They don't just go to the place and vote blindly.
Sure.
So they got plenty of time to choose based on the issues, but also the fact that if you want to mention a few sentences about voting for the Electoral College, or they
Right.
really think they're voting for candidates, that's something that's always argued about.
Yeah, I mean, the Electoral College is obviously getting
Yeah.
a little bit more play now than it was before. And I don't know if I have. I mean, one thing I sort of continue to hone in on this. I think the more that we can focus on the local, the better. If you vote in Rhode Island, unfortunately, your vote for president probably doesn't, matter as much as your vote for city council members or for state reps or for state senators. But I think, it'd be interesting to see if there's different states that are actually experimenting with different ways of thinking about the Electoral College. Maine just put into to play a ranked voting system, which allows you to rank different people. So I think there's different ways of looking at about it now, and I'm curious if that becomes a bigger issue.
Hi, one quick factual question and then the related, more interesting question. Is it not the case anymore that every state in the country requires civics education in high school?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of states require it but don't have assessments. And so what that means is that schools aren't necessarily incentivized to teach it. And a lot of times, a lot of times it will fall to second semester, senior year, and a gym teacher will teach civics. It's not prioritized.
That was mine.
Yeah. So I think that's what happens more cases than not. But there's not ramifications for schools not doing civics, and they're not incentivized to do it because we're not providing resources for them to do so.
So you're saying they can choose not to do it with no legal ramifications?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's depressing.
Yeah.
But anyway, the other question is, so I was interested in your map about where you're doing your work, and so I'm just going to focus on the middle of the country, but you can talk about the coast too. What kind of response are you getting from local educational officials in Oklahoma City or New York City or wherever to your initiatives? Because I think it's a great initiative.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So one thing that I should say is that just even in going to these communities, I think that the real gap that we have in this country is not necessarily coast versus middle of the country, it's urban versus rural. And so that's something that we're seeing overwhelmingly. So even in a place like Oklahoma City, it's going to be on the aggregate more liberal than conservative. At the same time, I think we are learning lessons there. And I think we believe, idealistically, but that action civics as a concept is something that's nonpartisan. I will say a specific example of something that happened recently that I thought was really interesting. We want our teachers to be completely non-political. Sometimes that doesn't always work. There was a teacher in Oklahoma City that was making, some more liberal comments, and a student in her class said, "This actually makes me really uncomfortable. I'm a conservative Republican." That wouldn't happen as much in any of our existing sites. And we actually want more of that to happen. Because again, I think if folks focus on the local, there's more areas where we can actually come to points of agreement. We're going through a next iteration of our strategic plan, and I think we are going to have more of a focus on the rural. Because if you look at rural populations, they actually feel very marginalized and civically engaged and aren't in touch with institutions too. And so I think there's something to how can we teach them how to interact with these institutions as well. So we're on a learning journey to figure that out as well.
So I'm just wondering about scaling up, especially if scaling up into rural areas. Like, that seems like a lot of ground to cover, and just wondering what your plan is and how to do that most effectively without diluting anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. So if anyone has any answers on that, let me know. I mean, that's literally what we're trying to figure out right now. And I think this question of scale while maintaining quality and fidelity of the program, in each of these 6 sites right now, we actually have staff on the ground. And so they're going into classes over the course of the semester. They're hand-holding teachers. I mean, we have a fairly robust operation. There's no way that we can cover rural populations and have a staff person there. And so we're looking into different ways of training. The other thing that's important to us is that we don't want to go to a rural community and be like, hey, here we are from New York and Rhode Island, and you should do this program, right? And so we are hearing some demand, but we're going to have to figure out, how do we adjust to their own cultural realities? And how do we help provide capacity rather than doing our own programming? So I think we're looking at different ways of training, different ways of consulting. I think of Generation Citizen as a curriculum, training, and consulting organization. And without one of those 3, it doesn't work. So we're not just shipping curriculum, we're not just doing training, and we're not just providing support. So how do you provide all 3 of those in rural areas? So we're trying to figure that out.
I'm going to float a theory, which isn't about geography or rural urban, but about developmental psychology. Seems to me that you'd be much better off educating 3rd and 4th graders toward action participation rather than 8th or 9th or up to high school seniors. And I'm not a developmental psychologist, but I think it must be true that the impressionable ages are younger ages. So you may be encouraging information and awareness, but not that emotional identification. You talked about identity, unless you're getting students at a younger age. So why, if Generation Citizen is focusing on high school, on the basis of what data or what success, and might you be willing to rethink it or complement it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So maybe we should rethink everything and do elementary school. I think part of it is that we can talk. I think part of it is that I would argue that civics education should happen everywhere. And so we've just chosen this as our lane, and we would hope that other people are choosing the other lane, and there hasn't been as much. I will say my best friend from Brown became a 4th grade teacher, and I went into his class and piloted this out, and it worked quite well. Part of the reason is because they were really eager to participate, and sometimes older generations can be a little more jaded, if you will. I think that in terms of the political action that they're taking, we found that it's hard for 3rd and 4th graders to engage with city council members, state reps, and be taken seriously, but maybe that's not the greatest approach on our side. So I think it's something that's interesting. We've just chosen that based on some research, but I've also seen some research that says that you should start younger. So I don't have a great answer to your question besides just that's where we focused our resources for now.
Hi. So I guess my question, I'm just sort of thinking about like the gap that like millennials and sort of young people sit in between high school and then like having a family and settling down, and how young people between like college and like starting out their careers don't really have a sense of place necessarily. Like their locations are very rooted in like private institutions like universities or jobs, and how that's like kind of like rooted in their brains that they don't have to have like really an investment in their location because it could change kind of on a whim within a few years. So I'm wondering, like, I guess my question is, well, I understand that like civics education in high school is really important. How does that translate from just an education to like an idea that like it doesn't really matter like how long you're in a place or if you're just in a place for university or for a job, that like your physical place and your voice in that place for whatever period of time either matters or, I mean, I know there's like a lot of discussion also on college campuses that like maybe we shouldn't vote in our college towns because we're like imposing kind of a voice that might not be like super representative of the community. So like, I guess my question is like, what's your opinion
Yeah.
on having a sense of place, even if it might be like temporary?
Yeah, it's a great question, and again, you're asking someone that usually lives in someplace for 2 to 3 years, and that's how I grew up. And what's interesting about being at Brown for me is that being here for 4 years, I actually felt a huge sense of identity in Rhode Island. So I actually think that 4 years is a good amount of time. I do think it's interesting to think about. It seems like, and I'm sure there's research that demonstrates this, that young people in this generation are more mobile and moving around, and how that actually relates to the fact that democracy needs to be local in our representative democracy, if that's problematic. And I think that, you know, maybe people do participate more once they put roots down. But I also think that there's ways to to participate. So if you're a Brown student, there's ways to go to community meetings and be involved in Rhode Island politics, just not necessarily be the leader. So I think a lot of times, you know, as Brown students, we want to lead things, but there's ways to participate and listen to what's going on in the community and participate in that way too. So I would say that sometimes, I mean, I've talked to people that make the case, well, should people actually, you know, should Brown students actually participate in Rhode Island and Providence politics? They're only here 4 years. One is that 4 years is a decent amount of time, and I think you can actually get to know a place in 4 years. And the other is that I think that notion of listening rather than leading all the time is one way to think about it as well.
I think we have time. Ooh.
You want to go first?
We have time for two.
And I know people might have class, so that's fine.
Thank you very much. This is fascinating stuff. In Switzerland, of course, participation is mandated. People who are not excused for reasons of health or being out of the country are required to vote. Switzerland does a lot of things right in terms of their civic society. I don't think we are going to impose that kind of expectation on frontier-minded Americans. But with regard to the local issues and how to translate those into sort of a national platform, right now, in the last, since the election in November and the inauguration just 7 weeks ago, a number of communities have been galvanized because of the issues that have been raised. We're talking in Rhode Island and in Providence about having a sanctuary, kind of a resistance to certain federal imposition of authority. It's gotten into the interfaith community, largely on issues of immigration and refugee access. We're talking about very radical thoughts about what are the prescriptions for adjusting to the Affordable Care Act and how that's going to affect states like Rhode Island that have signed into it and committed to it. How do you translate, I think, a lot of local energy, and I'd throw in the environment in Rhode Island as well, into the broader national discussion? We do have a very blue congressional delegation here. They're, I think, good negotiators. They talk to their Republican colleagues. But do you do it on the basis of identity in the issues or with the machinery of
Right.
the Congress and the federal government?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I do think that a lot of this energy that has happened since the election is a positive, because people are thinking about, are there ways that local municipalities can do things in different ways. I think the carbon tax in Rhode Island would be an example. I think Sanctuary Cities is an interesting example too. I think healthcare is an example of ways that states might be able to do things on their own. Funding is going to be a little difficult with these things. I mean, some of it is that there has to, I mean, and this process is hard, but there has to be some education from people on sort of the distinction between local and national issues. But what I think is going to be the most important thing is to ensure that this engagement is sustained. And that's something that I'm hopeful for, but we'll have to see, right? So, I mean, it's been 7 weeks since the inauguration. So what happens when, millions of people make calls to their senator and, the Secretary of Education is still confirmed? That stuff like that's going to happen, right? And I think one of the things that I think about when it comes to politics is that participating in our democracy is very necessary, and political change takes a lot of time. And those are two truths that are hard to hold at the same time, especially in a day and age where we want to see sort of instant, gratification. And I see a lot of people that are trying to come up with apps to facilitate better political engagement, and that's fine, but that's not going to solve, the basic problems that this change takes a while. And so I think if we're in a bad place in our democracy, getting to a better place is also going to take a long time. And so I think, it's a long way of saying to your answer is that we just need more sustained engagement. And so I hope people just continue to stay engaged, and that's the best solution right now.
Thinking about a talk on teaching for democracy, and thinking about the time that you apparently have right now, for reflection on this. I'm wondering, I think of civics as something that isn't necessarily a course, but is a way of teaching the skills, habits, and dispositions of citizenship through a lot of different avenues. But one of the biggest needs that it appears to me we have right now is civic literacy. Is how to understand the media, is how to understand bias, how to understand where things come from, and need I say fake news or alternative facts. Are you spending some time thinking about that question, and what are your reflections on it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I totally agree with you that civics is something that should be, and going to the elementary thing, sort of like a state of education rather than a specific course. I'd say the way that I answer this is that we are trying to include civic literacy, and I still think the best way of doing that is for us, if young people are motivated to learn civics through these projects, there's a way to incorporate civic literacy into there. So one analogy that I think of, because a lot of times people will say, oh, we should focus on the historical documents, or we should focus on learning how government works, and some of the distinction is, the best way to get people to learn about chemistry is not to get them to memorize the periodic table, right? You want them to learn how chemistry works and go backwards from there and learn the periodic table. And so that's, I guess, how I would think about civics, is that we want them to care about the issues, and from there incorporate civic literacy along the way. So if my class is focused on climate change in Rhode Island, let's figure out how to use that as a way to get them to understand how to actually interpret information. And that's some information that can be interpreted in science class. They can be looking at surveys in math class. They can be reading in English. So I think there's a way to incorporate civic literacy all throughout as well. But I think that's, the whole, fact-based culture one is obviously important too, and it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
I have two questions. One, I understand that you are using college students to have near-peer mentoring. Are you using only students who are getting, bachelor's degrees, or are you working with the community colleges, which might be another reservoir of untapped potential? And secondly, you had mentioned that a lot of the, I may not get this right, but a lot of the conversations are conversations that we have with people that we like or think like us. So how are you getting that dialogue or that interrogation across difference? Because we're all finding ourselves in bubbles, younger and younger even. And so if we don't learn how to work across the aisle, we just don't work together at all.
Yeah, no, I think both great questions. So one on the first question. In Rhode Island, we work with Brown, URI, Providence College. I think there's ways for us to work with community colleges more than we have. In New York, we've started doing that more. I think that it's something that it requires a little bit of a different model, but it's something that we definitely need to look into. So I think that's a good question, and working with CCRI and other colleges here is a great idea. So the second question, some of that's a self-segregation that's happening because people are moving to different places, so it's hard for us to do everything on that. I think in our curriculum, we actively try to get young people to learn how to talk through disagreement. And so we have a consensus-building process for them to agree on their issue. And I think them learning how to disagree with each other. I tend to think that the problem that we as a country right now is not that we can't agree with each other. It's that we've forgotten how to disagree with each other. And so I think that's something that's interesting. And I think on the organizational level, going to Oklahoma and Texas, I mean, I was talking to an Oklahoma supporter and a board member, about a month ago, and he had just got back from DC for the inauguration, and he wasn't there to protest. So I think the more that we can get people, to be part of the organization that espouse different principles is really important as well.
Well, so anyway, we are sadly out of time. Scott, that was incredibly insightful and thoughtful about your path, and I really appreciate you bringing that in, because I think as citizens, we all have to think about where we all fit into that participatory framework, and really appreciate your comments today, and I want to really thank everybody for coming and for your thoughtful questions.